We're thrilled to be joined by this week's Beast of the Week, Saad Mohseni, nicknamed the Rupert Murdoch of Afghanistan, if you can believe that. He's the chairman and the CEO of Moby Group, the largest media company in Afghanistan, and he's been widely applauded for bringing a free press to a repressed country, which he reflects on in his latest book, Radio Free Afghanistan, a 20-year odyssey for an independent voice in Kabul.
We wanted to talk to him because he's familiar, very, very familiar with trying to run a media company under a regime that believes the media is the enemy. And I'm just so curious if you want your nickname to be the Rupert Murdoch of Afghanistan.
I think the first time I met you, someone said, this is the Rupert Murdoch of Afghanistan, which was really a bit of a head fuck.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Well, it's probably not fair on Rupert, and it's probably not true in any case. But we were in business together. Rupert Murdoch invested in our group as we expanded beyond Afghanistan. We set up operations for the Persian market, targeting Iran in 2007 or 8. And then Pakistan, we were in India, we were in Africa, in the Middle East. So he was a partner, actually, for a long time.
Well, I want to say just right up front that I'm enjoying your book so much. I think it's really, really fascinating. We'd love to get just some context. What does governance feel like in Afghanistan right now?
Well, you have a sort of an authoritarian regime that was fighting the Afghan government and its backers, the international forces, a coalition of mostly Western forces, for 20-odd years. And they prevailed following a deal with the Trump administration in 2020. And they took over and with virtually no experience in governing. Mm-hmm. But strangely, there are some successes. I think, and I think most Afghans would agree with me, that they're less corrupt than the previous government.
The Taliban is less corrupt, because if you see it through the eyes of Americans, what we remember, or perhaps this is my ignorance about Afghanistan, which is pretty much 100%, but we saw those terrible images of the Americans pulling out, people falling from planes that they were clinging onto to try and leave. And then basically there's been radio silence. So apart from images of the Taliban coming in with guns, and then we hear that women can't go to college, they can't go to school, they have to stay indoors. So it's hard to believe that this is a less corrupt regime than the one that went before. Can you elaborate, explain?
Well, as most things, the situation on the ground is always a lot more nuanced. I mean, one of the reasons, and people ask me often, why is it that $1 trillion, 3,000 American soldiers losing their lives, thousands more losing their limbs, maybe 80 to 100,000 Afghan soldiers losing their lives, that after 2 decades, this war was lost? And it was mostly, I think, because of, corruption, the ineptitude of the state, and the fact that we had a democracy, but we had no justice. So people felt that it wasn't a just environment. And the Taliban arrived, saying, hey, we're here to serve you. So the courts functioned better. The government, of course, is more attentive to people's needs. The private sector seems to be in a better place than it was before. But of course, the flip side is that the economy's shrunk. The international community is disengaged, but then impacts the humanitarian situation on the ground. And the country is very vulnerable, 43 million people. Half the population is under the age of 20. Perhaps the youngest country outside of sub-Saharan Africa, median age of 18. And as you pointed out, everyone's forgotten about Afghanistan. So the Taliban, security situation is better because they were doing most of the killing. Well, both sides were, but the Taliban were.
So there are fewer people being killed?
Yes, and that's obvious. Less corruption. Cultivation of opium has been banned, so that's a positive. But so there are some positives, but of course the negatives are really obvious, like a ban on girls' education beyond 6th grade, trying to curtail what women can do in the workplace. Again, policy and decree-wise, it's very hardcore. Implementation-wise, Taliban leaders are being a lot more pragmatic, and we can talk about that. But for example, women are still working for us. Women are still working for NGOs. Women are still working for the government in most of the country.
So talk to us about, you have female anchors reading the news. You had some of them actually interviewing some of the government officials. Are they anxious about their security? Do they have to have security with them? I mean, at least in terms of the messaging we get here, and I appreciate it's more nuanced on the ground, it feels like it's a police state for women.
Well, I think it's a sort of a police state for everyone. For women, it's a lot more difficult because, and we can get into why this misogyny with these types of individuals or movements or religious groups. But so women continue to work for us. As a matter of fact, we have 3 times as many women working in our news department than we did in 2021, because we've been very actively trying to recruit and hire women. But yes, they present the news, they're on the field, they're behind the cameras, in front of the cameras. And I recall my mom telling me that she went to the passport office trying to help a woman get a passport. And then all the women started to stand up and scream at the Taliban guy. He got so scared he went inside his office and locked himself up. So I think a lot of it comes from sort of they haven't engaged with women for decades, and all of a sudden they have to govern over this country, and half the population is female. So it's, things can improve. I mean, I think the problem for us right now is a sort of a crossroad. Things can ease up and they can be more inclusive, or they can really go hardcore misogynistic.
I just want to say that as I'm reading the book, you have such a pragmatic approach to your work. It seems like it's such a great example of just playing the hand of cards that you were dealt. And a theme of the book is that engagement with them does not equate with recognition. Can you describe what it is to work with them, because you've had to change the way that you work. Can you kind of talk about the progress of that over time?
So we have 400 odd employees across the country. And we just did a survey and assessing how the employees feel. Our female employees are far more optimistic than their male counterparts. They're enthusiastic to come to work. They're excited about it. They do better. And one of our most senior executives, who runs two of the country's largest radio networks, was just recognized by the Emir of Qatar at the Doha Forum only like 4 days ago. So we have this extraordinary team of individuals, including women, who work in these really difficult conditions.
But if you're an anchor on Tolo News, are you in danger if you're a woman? I mean, do you need security to go in and out of the studio?
The quick answer would be no. But at the same time, if they're recognized on the street and some local Taliban official may say, hey, why are you appearing on television? This is un-Islamic. You shouldn't be like that. So there's always the risk of that sort of thing happening. But they tend to get home in a car, and so they're relatively safe. They're sort of in their own bubble. In a place like Kabul, 5 to 7 million people live in Kabul. And Herat and Mazar, now major cities, things are okay for women. As a matter of fact, my mom's there right now, and women walk around, faces uncovered, they go to the shops, women can drive. I mean, I don't want to give the impression that everything's okay, but it could be worse.
And what about the internet in terms of how much access do people have to it?
Well, the numbers range from, say, 10 million to 15 million people. It's not a lot of people, mostly because it's expensive. For example, our education programs, people can access the internet now at zero cost. So it's being subsidized. But television and radio is still probably the best means of delivering content to families. It's a bit like the 1950s in the US. People have single TV households, people have a radio set, and you can power these things up using a car battery. People are very pragmatic in terms of how they deal with things on a day-to-day basis. So, but people, the country is a changed country from 20 years ago. The genie's out of the bottle, you can't put it back in. People have been exposed to the international community, they've looked at programs, they get news from the outside, they know what's going on.
How do you know, in the line of work that you do, how do you know when you're coming up against the line, and how do you navigate that? When you have the Taliban in your ear, how do you know how much to push back, I guess?
By nature, you push back.
Right.
You always push the envelope. You can't help yourself. As a media person, we're always we're always going just over the line.
Okay.
And we get admonished for these things quite often. And I think the first chapter of the book is about an incident that then the Taliban raided our offices and took our guys in. It's we leave it up to the guys on the ground, but it's by nature they're kids in their 20s, most of them. The average age is probably in the mid-20s. So they have not neglected their duties as journalists, as content providers. They're told you can't air music, so music is off.
Because music's been banned by the Taliban, right?
Music's been banned, yes.
And does that mean it's literally been banned and you don't hear music in Afghanistan, or do you hear music, but to your earlier point, it's not, the ban is not enforced?
Well, and if you go to, in Kabul, around the city, people have music on. They get it via satellite. They listen to CDs, or, they may have Spotify or Apple Music. Some people do. So, yes, music. I mean, how could you not have music? So people can access music, and everything's available.
I understand it's more nuanced when you get there on the ground. But is the Taliban just performative then? I mean, they're saying one thing, but in fact people are just getting on with their lives, and it's not as strict as it sounds like it is to us. Because I'm still finding it hard to reconcile women unable to go to school or get education post grade 6 with you having female anchors who are fine to carry on reading the news.
Well, again, the situation is not that bad in some parts of the country, but in other parts it's totally imposed. Like in a small village or in a city that's conservative, it's imposed 100%. You won't be able. If you listen to music and a guy stops your car, he'll probably whip you. But in the major cities,
he'll probably whip you for listening to music.
Absolutely. But in Kabul, for example, or in other parts of the country where the sort of the man in charge or the men in charge are more pragmatic, they have a very laissez-faire approach to this. So for some people it's serious in terms of the imposition of these decrees, but some of the others are more pragmatic. So for example, if you look at Joanna in Syria, for example, he's very similar to some of the more pragmatic Taliban.
This is the new rebel leader who's just taken over in Syria.
Who, by the way, interestingly enough, has taken sort of the Taliban playbook in terms of winning hearts and minds and all of that, in terms of how you convince people not to fight them. It's been pretty much a cut and paste of what the Taliban did in 2020, 2021. But some of these folks in Kabul, some of these Taliban, the so-called pragmatic leaders, are very frustrated with the leadership's hardcore approach to girls' education and women in the workforce. So I think there is a tug of war between these different forces, and it's not a monolithic movement. You do have individuals with different degrees of conservatism and how they interpret Islam, and some of them are just there for power. I mean, you're dealing with politicians, right?
So they're expedient.
Yes. So we're in a very interesting place right now, especially what's happening in Syria, because I think a lot of the Taliban are looking at Syria, and they will think, wow, if this guy can, come back in, and he gets the sanctions lifted, and then there's a bounty on his head, well, maybe the same thing can happen to us. It could perhaps inspire the Taliban also to make changes in the way that they govern.
But do you think that your work is making meaningful change within the Taliban? Are you contributing to that kind of like push and pull within the organization?
I hope so. It's upon us as Afghans to push all sides.
Right.
We've done like I've lost count, 1,500, 2,000 stories on girls' education and why it should be permissible under the Taliban rules. So we're very sort of provocative. But we do it by not interviewing some PhD from NYU. We do it by interviewing people from within the Taliban ranks or individuals who are respected by the Taliban, because we have to make these changes from within. And it's upon us as Afghans to push for these changes. We're now tutoring a group of girls using WhatsApp. Okay. So they go to WhatsApp and ask questions, and there's a group.
And that's not illegal.
Because, what we teach reflects the curricula. So it's the maths that they would learn at school, right? So now we're trying to integrate AI into these our WhatsApp chat groups. So whether, there is a sort of a chat box that's responsive that can deal with their questions. The girls do better. Actually, the girls who don't go to school tend to do better than the boys who go to school.
Oh.
Weirdly, because they've retained enough information. But the girls who also get tutored on this WhatsApp group can also pass on what they're learning to their brothers within each household. So and UNICEF, we work with UNICEF on this, are just, for them it's an extraordinary result.
But is there a sort of situation where people are doing this in hiding? I mean, if girls' education has been banned, if you can get whipped for listening to music, if you're caught learning math and you're a 14-year-old girl on WhatsApp, what is the consequence?
For now, it seems it's okay. But again, everything I have to end with for now. By the way, this is no substitute for a school. You go to school for a whole bunch of other reasons besides learning. You interact with other kids, you play. I mean, these kids must be going through hell. These girls are stuck inside the house. It is a human rights violation to deprive children of not being able to go to school or banning women from working. I mean, women for now can work, but we don't know.
When I first met you, you talked about having taken the format of American Idol to Afghanistan. Can you just tell us a little bit about how popular it became?
Well, it was enormously popular because it's, one thing, and we've been, operating across the world, in Africa and the Middle East and so forth. It's how similar we are. We react to similar things. That's why a format, if it does well in the US, will do well in Africa. So we basically created this format, which is like an idol format.
Was it called Kabul Idol? What was it called?
It was called Afghan Star.
Afghan Star, that's right.
And, initially it was almost like a comedy because people just were, they had a lot of things, but talent wasn't one of them.
I feel like I think I watched a lot of episodes
But eventually it got better.
Right.
And they could perform and whatever. But initially the first couple of seasons were actually quite interesting, to say the least. And but they had confidence, I have to say that.
And were they singing Western songs or Afghani songs? Or
Both.
Right.
Both. Initially it was like, taking an Indian song or sometimes even a Western song. But eventually, it was like their own compositions or singing other famous Afghan songs. But it was phenomenally, it was one of our most successful stories. It really engaged the nation. And millions of people used to vote using in the early days, it was texting, and eventually it was online. But it captivated an entire country in terms of who would win. And it was very, very stressful for a lot of people, to wait for the results. Now, we can't do those sorts of programs, but people continue to perform and make videos from outside the country and sometimes from inside the country. And this stuff sits on different platforms like YouTube and satellite television networks. They have a satellite dish, they have a mobile phone, they have a laptop. So they're able to, get any content they want, and it's all available.
What would you want people to know about Afghanistan that you feel here that we really don't understand?
Well, right now people just have zero interest in Afghanistan because it was in the headlines for such a long time, and people see it as a complete failure. And I think the nation-building bit of it may have not been an entire success. And of course, a lot of people feel, what did we do in the 20 years we were in Afghanistan, all that money spent? But I think it was transformative for the people of Afghanistan. Our literacy rates were like at 25 or 30%. Today, something like 75, 80% of younger people are literate. Life expectancy went up by 50%. Child mortality dropped significantly. The infrastructure was built. So the Taliban weirdly inherited this really sort of, relatively speaking, developed country with a proper bureaucracy and roads and everything else. So one of the reasons why we would like for the world to not disengage is because in order to sustain those gains, let's not forget about the people of the country. Now, of course, you don't want the Taliban to get recognized until they deal with issues like inclusivity. You can't just not allow other people to be involved in the governing process, or not allow women to work or to go to school or to go to university. So those things need to be addressed. But I think the baby steps are that, you sit with them, you talk to them, you talk to the more pragmatic ones. You encourage them to move against, the more conservative brethren of theirs. And, I'm not sure sometimes. I ask myself the same question: how do we best achieve that?
Right.
But I'm pretty confident that disengaging is not the right way.
So engagement, baby steps engagement.
Yeah, but the world is engaging anyway.
Right.
You have to fly aid into the country. You have to talk to the Taliban. You distribute it. You have to engage with the Taliban. To address human rights issues, you have to engage with them. But you should have a framework of sorts through which you engage. I think that's the best way of putting it.
Right. Wow, this is so interesting.
It is interesting. So give us 5 minutes on what you predict for Syria, in as much as a simple question, but in as much as you have a very different vantage point than we do. Well,
Syria is an enormously important country for the Middle East. The population of 25 million. It sits in a really important location in the Levant. And Syria has been ruled by one family for over 5 decades. It was a very nasty regime. And it was basically, you talk about lack of inclusivity. It was a regime made up of a small religious sect that governed over a country and brutally. And there was a revolution of sorts in 2011. It failed. But the country ended up totally fragmented. Probably 3 weeks ago, that there was a move from one of the rebel groups, HTS, to capture Aleppo. They succeeded, and the rest, I mean, it just basically was a house of cards. It just completely fell. And you can go into why that happened and why now.
Were you surprised by it happening?
No, I wasn't surprised because the Iranians strategically took an interest in both Syria and Lebanon in the 1980s. They felt that they needed to create this sort of axis of resistance to be able to have leverage against Israel and Western powers. So they worked very closely with the Assad regime, and they armed and funded and trained Hezbollah in Lebanon. But since October the 7th, and the way that the Israelis and perhaps the Americans hit back at Hezbollah and, of course, at
Hamas
and Hamas inside Palestine, but Hezbollah in particular, and the Assad regime was weakened as well, because I think that they did target facilities and so forth inside of Syria, including assassinating Iranian Revolutionary Guard generals. But the other bit, which is important, is that Russia is distracted in Ukraine, and they didn't have the capacity to fight two major wars, and it just was a perfect storm, and it allowed the rebels. And I think the Turks played an important role. For the Turks, this is the ascendancy of the Turkish Republic. This is perhaps their most important win in the region. So the vacuum left by the Russians and the Iranians, to an extent, they made the most of it, and they backed and encouraged these rebels to take over the rest of the country, which they did. I think even the Turks are surprised. I was actually at the Doha Agreement. Just by chance, the Turkish foreign minister, the Qatari foreign minister, the Iranian foreign minister, the Russian foreign minister were all there for the conference. And this thing happened. So all of a sudden, all the forums are getting canceled. They're going into private rooms to discuss the war. And then the Saudis and the Egyptians showed up as well. I don't think the Turks realized how quickly this whole thing would fall apart. So they're in a prime position. But as to what happens next, I'm not too sure. HTS is a rebranded Islamist group that has had a history with Al-Qaeda, and this charismatic leader, Joanna, who has emerged as as a sort of savior of Syria. The jury's out as to how conservative or how liberal he'll be. He's making all the right signals, and he's giving the impression that he's going to be inclusive.
Right.
For now. Let's see.
Right. How are you covering it on your news network?
Well, for us, it's really important because the Taliban were doing handstands when they emerged victorious. But I think it's also an important lesson, because if we can exhibit, hey, they're here, but they're allowing women to go about their business. They don't have to cover up their faces. That they're inclusive. They're allowing others, Christians and other minorities, to be part of this governing body. There's a lesson for the Taliban.
Right.
I said last year that what's happened in Gaza will be perhaps one of the most consequential events of our lifetime. Now, how it's going to unfold, we're not quite sure if it's going to be good or bad. Even in Syria, we're not quite sure how it's going to actually end up for the Syrians and for the neighborhood.
And what happens to Assad now? He's fled to Moscow, where he's been given asylum. But what happens to him?
I would suspect he's protected. He'll be, living his life in Moscow, and probably he'll open up an eye clinic.
That's right.
Yeah.
Oh, that's right. I always
'cause,
forget.
Yeah, he's got to keep a lot of Louis Vuitton.
I saw some.
You know.
Apparently in Aleppo, they captured a photo album of his, and there's some topless pictures of him. Not naked, but he's wearing swimming trunks.
I saw those pictures. He's wearing briefs.
You cannot unsee them.
Well, it's a fascinating time. I find it interesting because so much discussion here was America's eye is off the ball, China's going to go into Taiwan, the world order will change. And I feel like it was not expected, certainly by our media, or certainly wasn't covered, what would happen in Syria, and as fast as it did. These things always happen much faster. As you say, it was a house of cards, and the thing collapses and people didn't anticipate it.
But the Trump administration has made it very clear that we don't want to be involved. Trump didn't tweet the social media thing, whatever it's called.
His platform, Truth Social, and then Elon's is X.
Yeah, he Truth Socialed it. That he doesn't want to be involved. The problem is that leaders always face things they don't expect, right? So does he have the temperament? Does he have a team that can deal with multiple crises all at the same time?
I believe that I can answer that question.
I'm
and
sure
the
you
answer
can.
is no. He does not have a team who can deal with that in the moment.
I think what's interesting about Trump is that he's unpredictable, and that's a good thing for now. But also there's some predictability that you want to be able to predict certain things in
Right.
international affairs. But I think there'll be
Yeah.
lots of other crises that he may not have the ability to deal with.
He will not have the ability to. He's a little bit loosey-goosey
Well,
on
he's
the
also 78 years old.
policy front.
But the other thing is that people have this nostalgia about strongmen. And then let me
Yes.
tell you, from someone who's dealt with strongmen, it's not the answer.
Yes, we have a lot of macho men all over the world making bad decisions.
Wrong and strong, as Bill
Yeah.
Clinton said. They all vote for wrong and strong every time. Saad, thank you so much for
Thank
coming
you
in
so
and talking
much.
to us.
This was
Thank you.
really, really interesting, and I encourage everybody to purchase and read your book because it's wonderful.
Thank you.